Wuthering Waves is right around the corner, so I thought I'd showcase all the characters, how they play, and how good I think they are. There are 7 characters on launch of Wuthering Waves, with 1 on a limited banner, Jiyan, and an 8th arriving as a second limited banner, Yinlin. Without trying them, it can be a bit hard to decide who you want to use or how they play. This video will go over all the 5-star characters that we have info on, and their skill sets and playstyles. I'll also be placing all of them on a tier list as I go, of how useful I feel that they are, but keep in mind that over time, some of these can change. Most of this info is from the most recent beta, which I played 100 hours of, and some things may have changed, such as the damage numbers. Every character has a basic attack string, heavy attack, dash attack, and a plunging attack. They also have a passive known as a Forte Circuit, a resonance skill, and an ultimate ability known as Resonance Liberation. Also, when entering or leaving battle, they have an intro and outro skill they use. Let's start with Jianxin. She's an arrow, element, fist weapon, support DPS. She's mainly used for enemy area clear while supporting the team. Her 3 basic attacks linger super long, making it really easy to parry with her, but they don't really hit super hard. Her skill is an inbuilt parry that charges until you're attacked, doing extra damage when successfully parrying in an area ahead of her. The damage wasn't really amazing when used, but made it really easy to parry difficult to dodge attacks. Her Forte Circuit passive builds with any attacker skills that she uses, and when using a charge attack, it continually drains the bar to do constant area damage around her, while also creating a large shield that stays even when swapping characters. The damage is actually pretty impressive, but it leaves you stationary for really long. It can be dangerous to actually use versus some of the harder hitting enemies, especially bosses, but it's really good for clearing a bunch of weaker enemies out. Her ultimate actually makes a tornado that pulls enemies in, doing some decent damage and exploding at the end, which can be comboed pretty well with her passive as well. Her intro skill pulls enemies in, doing some damage, while her outro skill buffs the next character with increased ultimate damage. Overall, Jianxin was one of my most hyped up characters, but she overall felt a bit on the weaker side, and most of her damage wasn't really all that incredible except against a bunch of mobs out on the field, which admittedly can be pretty useful in some content, but she just wasn't contributing enough for some of the really hard battles such as bosses. So on the tier list right here, I would probably place her, honestly, somewhere around C or D tier. I'm thinking at the moment D tier, but if more content arrives where you need a lot of area clear, it's possible she would be at least C or possibly even go up to B if you need a lot of crowd control and just being able to kill a ton of enemies at the same time, because her charge attack does do pretty good damage. Supposedly she's supposed to be changed before the launch of the game, they said, but we don't really know how much or what they're doing, so at the moment I would probably place her near the bottom. Calcharo is an electro sword user that's used for big DPS. His basic attack chain is fairly normal with nothing especially amazing about it. His skill can be used 3 times in succession and can be used to combo between his basic attack string, extending his combos much more and dealing good damage. This can also allow you to parry way easier by interweaving his attacks and skills when a parryable attack is incoming. His Forte Circuit passive gains charges when using his skill and changes his heavy attack to expend the charges for extra damage. Calcharo's ult is what makes him the most interesting, causing an explosion of damage before transforming and causing all of his basic attacks to be much stronger. When in this form, his Forte Circuit passive changes to 5 bars instead of 3, and he actually gains bars from using his basic attack while in his ult form. His intro skill deals a bit of damage, but his outro skill hits really hard, making an impact when he leaves the field. Overall, Calcharo seems like a pretty solid DPS choice to use with his consistent damage, and he doesn't really have to be on the field super long to do a pretty large amount. But the issue is that you kind of have to use him as a main DPS. Overall, I think Calcharo is one of the better DPS characters in the game, and I think at the moment I would maybe place him around A tier. He has decent supports, Yinlin that we'll talk about later, and also I believe there are some 4 stars that he combos well with. He's a good electro damage dealer all in all, and I think one of the better DPS choices to go for. Encore is a fire catalyst using damage dealer, and she's very ayaya. Her basic attack chain is decent range damage, but since it's a catalyst, sometimes it can be kind of hard to parry with. I believe her first and second attacks of her basic chain are unable to parry, at least they were in the beta that I played, and I found I was mostly only able to parry with either the third attack in the string or her jump attack or intro skill. Otherwise, you just have to dodge. Her skill causes her to repeatedly shoot fire, and when used again at the right time, shoots a large fireball doing an extra amount of damage. Her Forte Circuit passive grows as she attacks or uses skills, and when it's full, her next charged attack becomes a channeling ability that gives her 70% damage reduction, I believe, and causes an explosion at the end. Overall, it can feel really awkward to use because she stands there for so long, but if you use it, you can actually swap to another character and she'll remain on the field continuing to charge it until it explodes. Her ultimate completely changes her entire character to melee and makes it so that all of her attacks go really fast, making it not only high DPS but also really easy to parry even if you're just spamming her attacks non-stop. It also changes her skill to be a fat burst of damage. Her intro skill does some damage while her outro skill creates a fire field that constantly does damage in an area, so you want to keep the enemy in it. Encore is actually a very solid DPS, and being ranged gives her a lot of ability to fight some of these bosses even when they're in the middle of their attacks, which would be really useful. The downside, I would say, is having some difficulty parrying or needing to know the boss even better to parry could make it difficult for some players to use her, but she is actually a pretty fun and interesting character. Overall, I think I would probably put Encore around B. I think that her damage might be a little bit lower than Calcharo overall, and she is a little bit harder to utilize for most players, but I think the extra range does give her a bit of an edge in some situations and can be very useful. She also doesn't have very good area clear whatsoever. Lingyang is a 5-star Glacio fist weapon user. His basic attacks are standard, with the 4th attack in the string lingering pretty long, making it pretty easy to use to parry. His heavy attack, however, is a combo that actually launches the opponent into the air and then slams them down. His skill punches ahead for some damage, but when used after his basic attack string, instead becomes a diving attack forward. His Forte Circuit passive is where he becomes much more interesting. Using a heavy attack when the passive bar is full causes him to don his lion dance mask and allows him to constantly float in the air dancing on the drums while attacking, changing his basic attack string, and it actually becomes really fun and interesting. His ultimate does a burst of damage and then gives him a buff that causes his passive gauge to go down half as fast, allowing him to be in the lion dance form for much longer. His intro skill does some damage, while his outro skill releases a shockwave doing a large amount of damage in an area around him. Overall, Lingyang is considered pretty weak. He's a little bit awkward to use, and he doesn't really hit all that hard. Most people were pretty unpleased with the character as a whole, and I think I would probably place him around the bottom tier. I would say he's probably worse than Jianxin overall as well, but he does have some fun, interesting mechanics you can play around, but just as a whole doesn't really mesh together well for a great character. Verina is a Spectro Catalyst user that's more for supporting than damage. Her basic attacks have decent range, with her charge attack rushing forward at the enemy to close the gap, while also being able to parry along with her plunge attack. Her skill simply does some damage and heals the party. However, when using her heavy attack, skill, or ultimate, she actually boosts the team's damage by 20%, giving a large boost to the entire team that not many characters are able to do, making her skill actually really powerful to just pop in and not only heal but damage boost for everybody. Her Forte Circuit passive gains stacks when finishing her attack chain or using her basic skill or intro skill, and when using heavy attacks expends a charge to give the party health and concerto energy for the next intro or outro skills. Her ultimate deals damage while healing allies but marks enemies. Marked enemies are damaged by Verina when an ally attacks them while also healing allies. She also has a secondary passive that revives a fallen ally once every 10 minutes in case you make a mistake. Her intro skill does some damage, while her outro puts a heal on the ally while also giving a damage boost to the team. Overall, Verina is considered by many to be one of the best 5 stars, and I'm not the biggest fan of their design, so I'm not really all that happy about that. But not only does she heal, which a lot of people are not really interested in healers since this is more of a damage dealing game, but more importantly, she's able to actually damage boost the team, which few characters can do. Just a large damage boost for everybody, and she also is able to just swap in really quickly, use her skill, damage boost the team, heal, and then swap to another character. Overall, I'd probably put her in S tier at launch. She just does things that other characters aren't really able to do, and is just a really top tier support that could kind of pair with anybody. Jiyan is a sword-using arrow damage dealer who's also the first non-standard limited character banner in Wuthering Waves. Although he uses a sword with his basic attack string, he actually turns it into a spear, and it actually makes him really good at parrying because it usually lingers for quite long in some of his attacks. His skill does a dashing spear attack forward, which can be used also while airborne. It's fast and it lingers a really long time, making it super easy to parry incoming attacks with. His Forte Circuit passive builds as you attacks and can be spent to empower the damage of his skill and ultimate. His ultimate changes attack string to not only do a bunch of extra damage and hit way more, but also drags weaker enemies into his attacks, stun locking them and dragging them with you as you're fighting. When used while having half of your Forte gauge, Jiyan does massive damage nuke in front of him as well. This ultimate does a ton of damage to bosses' stagger gauge, and makes him really good at area clear of just trash mobs while also having decent single target damage. His intro skill does some pretty good damage, but more importantly causes him to spawn in the air, allowing you to easily dodge attacks from enemies if you use it at the right time. His outro skill causes the next character's heavy attacks to summon a dragon, doing pretty large damage. Overall, Jiyan is a fairly fun and strong character. He has really good area clear and he has pretty decent single target versus some bosses. He's not really a must-pull kind of character, but he's just kind of good at everything to some degree. Overall, I would probably place him around A tier. I extensively used him in the beta, and I found him to just be a really solid character. Even though he didn't have the most insane DPS, it felt like he was just useful for all pieces of content. Yinlin is an Electro Catalyst user that's a damage dealer support and the second limited banner of Wuthering Waves, after Jiyan. Her basic attack string has decent range, but nothing really special. Her skill does damage in an area in front of her and causes her attacks to do extra electro damage, and can also be recast to do an extra burst of damage. Her Forte Circuit passive charges with any attack and skill used, and when it's full, the next heavy attack uses the full gauge to attack an enemy and marks them. When a marked target is attacked, all marked targets are hit by an electro blast up to once per second. What makes this so powerful is that other characters can also proc the mark, making her actually a really good damage support for the entire team. Her ultimate does a large amount of damage to a target, but nothing really else all that special. Her intro skill does some damage in an area, but her outro skill buffs the next character with extra electro damage pen and ult damage. This becomes really useful with a character like Calcharo. Overall, Yinlin is probably one of the best DPS supports in the game, pairing really well with a character like Calcharo since she buffs electro characters, and she's also a pretty good just damage dealer and support in general to have on your team. She is the second limited banner, so she'll be arriving after Jiyan, and you'll be able to test a lot of these other characters before she actually releases to see if you're actually interested in an electro support. But she seems like a pretty solid damage dealer and overall just really good to have. I think I would probably put her in S compared to these other characters, but you have to keep in mind this is compared to the base characters that are launching in Wuthering Waves. In the future, this might completely change and maybe she becomes not that great of support overall, but at the moment she is probably one of the best characters you could have on your team at the moment for 5 stars. Finally, let's go over the main character, Rover, the Spectro Sword user and the only free 5-star in the game. Surprisingly, they not only are pretty fun to play, but also strong. Their basic attacks are fast and linger long, allowing them to parry really easily compared to other characters, which can be pretty important versus some of the faster bosses. Their skill is a fast area damage ability in a circle around Rover. When their Forte Circuit passive is filled 50% or more from attacking, it also creates a spinning blade when using the skill, doing some extra damage to nearby enemies. Their Resonance Liberation does a relatively large area damage explosion after a short delay. Their intro skill increases their skill damage for a short duration after entering battle, while their outro skill slows time for enemies for a few seconds, even working on bosses. All in all, the character is really simple, and they are the main character after all, but they're also pretty darn useful as a main DPS. Most games don't make the main character all that strong, especially in a gacha game, but it seems as though Wuthering Waves actually went a little above and beyond on that and made the main character a really solid character in their own right. So I would probably place Rover somewhere around A with these characters. Now you might say you don't have anyone in C, but the reason I have no one in C tier is because I think these characters are significantly worse than these characters. Now you could potentially place Jianxin over in C tier, but I think overall, unless they change her, she's not really all that worthwhile to go for. And I think Encore is only slightly below these characters as a whole. Right now, this is the tier list and how I feel about the characters. You can take it with a bit of a grain of salt because usually tier lists made before a game releases can be inaccurate because people don't know exactly how everything works and how the end game will play and every piece of content. So sometimes people will realize, oh, some of these characters are actually better or some of these characters are actually worse. But this is how I feel about the characters at the moment. So that about all covers all the 5 stars currently known in the game. While this is how I feel with the characters at the moment, it could change. Please bear that in mind. This is not the end-all be-all tier list, and there could be power creep in the future that makes some of these characters a lot less useful. So please just pick the characters you think you would have the most enjoyment with rather than just the top meta pick, unless you really like the top meta picks, and then go for it. Thanks a bunch for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like or subscribe to the channel, and I'll be covering a lot of Wuthering Waves content in the future. Hope to see you next time.